Hi everyone, welcome to this video. Welcome back to the channel if you're a subscriber already. If you're not, then please consider to subscribe and hit the like button if this video is helpful. Okay, cut 3. Hi everyone, welcome to this video. In this video, we will discuss the shadow, a very important topic from Jungian psychoanalysis. And we'll cluster this video in 3 parts, or 3 parts roughly. So there will be a brief introduction to the shadow and the archetypes in general. Then we'll talk about the personal shadow and the collective shadow. And finally, we'll note some important key points, let's say, for shadow work, shadow realization, but also some general aspects to keep in mind. This will be a short introductory video, so please note that some of the concepts that I'll mention will probably be misunderstood until we explore them in further depth. If you've been watching my videos for a while, you know that I greatly appreciate if you like the video, leave a comment and let me know what you think of the content that we're discussing, and especially let me know what kind of content you would like to see in addition to this, and what aspects you would like me to highlight further. And I obviously also appreciate if you subscribe to the channel so you can be notified when new videos are released. All right, let's get right into it. The shadow is a part of the individual psyche, right? It's also an archetype. It expresses as an archetypal image, but it is also part of the component of the human psyche. And we may cluster it briefly into the personal shadow and the collective shadow, right? That's what I already mentioned in the introduction. It's important to note that if we talk about the shadow as an archetypal image, then we're always talking about a projection of the shadow function within the individual psyche onto something that's going on in the world. So we can't really say the shadow is an archetype just as we can say, oh, the anima is an archetype, as in person XYZ is the anima per se. No, that doesn't work. We can't say, Darth Vader is the shadow of Anakin Skywalker, for example. Like, yeah, we could say that it's portrayed like that, but if we talk about the archetype as a structure within the individual psyche, then we can't really make those statements. So that's very important off the bat. So let's read a quote from Jung here. Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's consciousness, the blacker and denser it is. If an inferiority is conscious, one always has a chance to correct it. But if it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it gets corrected and is liable to burst forth suddenly in a moment of unawareness. So, this is very important. The shadow contains that which is repressed, that which we do not recognize to be ourselves, the sort of the abject, if you will, that which is the appendix, but it is not relevant to our own existence in this moment. And that is speaking obviously from the perspective of the ego that builds a narrative about who we are and what we are, right? Pushes out certain aspects, oh, in brackets, this is not relevant, and then places them in a repository of, let's say, otherness within ourselves. And you now say maybe, yeah, well, maybe this is the entire unconscious, and that is, to an extent, that is true for Jung. The shadow is an aspect of the personal unconscious, but it is that which is darkest, so that which we do not want to see. Some of the unconscious aspects, and probably Freud would refer to them differently, but parts of that is also just the kind of stuff that we're just not aware of, but we could technically recall it. That's why I always say that the unconscious, the personal unconscious in Jung technically doesn't really exist. The material of the shadow could also be recalled. It springs forth potentially on its own accord in moments in which the ego structure, so this narrative that you have about yourself, is weakened. So whenever the ego, right, is not so strong, when it doesn't hold on to itself, when you're not composed, let's say, maybe in a moment when you're drunk, maybe when you're angry, maybe when a weak point is struck, so to speak, when you have a fight with your partner and your partner says, oh, but you're just like your mom or you're just like your dad. and that maybe strikes a nerve, as we say. And that nerve is precisely, it hits a certain complex within the unconscious, within the shadow, and that then springs forth. And suddenly you have this aggression, this anger that you can't explain. You're possessed. You know, Jung really compares this to sort of a possession, right? You're possessed because this unconscious complex suddenly replaces the ego, which is also just a complex, right? So Jung imagines the structure of the psyche composed by these complexes, and the ego is simply the dominant one in everyday life, and then the shadow may replace it momentarily, or an aspect of it, right? The shadow, in a way, is also what we're ought to be. So it's a place of improvement, it's a place of development, it's a place of growth. It is, in a sense, that which we can still grow into. If you think about this in terms of Jung's functions, so Jung's extroversion, introversion, so the psychological functions, then if you're an extrovert, introversion will be a shadow function. So introversion is where you can grow. And let's say you're an extroverted thinker, then introverted feeling is a shadow function that you have pushed into the shadows. So that is a place where you can develop, but that's also a place where you're particularly weakened. So if someone brings up introverted feeling, oh, why you're doing this? What's the value of this? You know, those kinds of questions, value questions, you know, you may be triggered, let's say, right? So the shadow is really a place of growth. And the ego's responsibility, in a way, is to assimilate, to bring light into the darkness and darkness into the light, right? You want to bring shadow material into the light, but that doesn't mean you have to explore your shadow. Please don't get this wrong. You know, people say, oh yeah, what are you doing? Well, I'm going here and I'm just trying to, you know, kind of like, whatever it is, fantasizing about killing my mother. And why are you doing that? Well, it's shadow exploration. It's like, well, I'm not so sure if that's really shadow, right? It's very conscious. And the question really is if you can explore your shadow with this conscious attitude, and we can talk about that perhaps in another video. But Jung generally, he writes, he says, there's no light without shadow and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. So it is very important that you can never really get rid of the shadow. The shadow is, in a way, you know, if you think about this in Hegelian terms, it is what determines the existence of the whole. So like, it's the antithesis that kind of determines the existence of the thesis, right? Of the ego as it stands there, right? It's sort of that which we negate determines that which we are, in a way, right? So you can never get rid of the shadow. You can try to assimilate it. You can try to implement it in this developmental path towards the self. But ultimately, as Jung points out, the self doesn't exist, right? And so let us now get into the collective aspect of the shadow, right? I just have to write this down for a second. So here. So the collective shadow essentially is the same thing, but on the level of humanity as a whole. So if you think about it, right, you have in Jungian theory, you have two layers of the unconscious, right? You have the personal unconscious, and then below that or beneath that, you have the collective unconscious. And both of these structures are influencing each other, if you will. So that which society suppresses is that which influences the individual, and vice versa. That which the individual suppresses is that which influences society ad ultimo, let's say, right? And so the idea here is that there's this saying, I think Jordan Peterson said it, we all have to understand, or we all have to accept that we could have been concentration camp guards, you know, in the Holocaust in Germany, right? And that's, I think, very important. You know, everyone always says, oh, like for example, now everyone says, oh, how can these terrible things happen in Gaza, and why is this all happening, and it's so brutal, and how police brutality, why can there be police brutality? I don't understand that this would have ever happened. This would never happen to me. But the truth is that because we share this common layer of the collective, and because we share this general structure and these complexes can take hold of us, that these kinds of things, I'm not saying this exact thing will happen perhaps, but these kinds of things, these kinds of actions could spring forth from ourselves. And that is precisely sort of attempting to understand, your own shadow as the collective, right? As that which everyone has always been doing. You know, there's a collective aspect to this darkness. It's not limited to what you are. It's not limited to what you sort of, what you have suppressed yourself. But there are topics, and that's another layer of it. There are topics that are, as humans, collectively shared, you know, in terms of the actual content of it. Finally, you know, we have images, obviously, that we have produced as a collective of the shadow. You know, here we can maybe talk about the devil. We can talk about, you know, other images of darkness, of evil. You know, hell as a repository of the shadow, for example, Dante. But megalomaniac projects are also shadow functions. So whenever you're like the Tower of Babel, for example, this vision to replace God, that is a let's say, an act of shadowness, an act of darkness in a way, if you will, right? And now, finally, I want to highlight some important remarks to sort of close this video. It's very simple to, you know, and other people that I've seen have highlighted this, that talked about the shadow. You know, we should take responsibility for this and that. We should take responsibility for our own shadow. We should take responsibility for the collective shadow. And Peterson himself highlights this in a bunch of videos, or a bunch of comments. And it's very important to differentiate between identification and the act of integration. So there is an element of recognition. So you see, oh, this is part of me. Oh, this is part of my history. And I am responsible for this, right? And this responsibility keeps you trapped within an ego structure that may turn out to be problematic because it has nothing really substantially to do with you. In the end, and Jung recognizes this, if we are everything, right? If the collective is past, present, and future, then we're also nothing, right? That's one of the consequences, like, right? Gesture tendencies cancel out. And it's this whole myth of free will that sort of plays a role here, where you can say, oh, I can determine what I'm doing. I can determine how I'm doing this. I know why X, Y, Z happened. If we just stop suppressing X, Y, Z, then I will achieve A. The point is, I think that, yes, maybe, but if the time isn't right, you know, if there's not the right kairos, you know, the as opposed to chronos, you know, chronos, the passage of time, kairos, the time moment, the temporal moment, this sort of, if you will, the synchronistic configuration. If that time isn't right, then whatever ought to be expressed is not going to express. And perhaps you're still going to try, and perhaps it's not going to work. And I think the goal here is really to develop an honesty, and an honesty for recognition and recognizing what is true right now, right here, about me in relationship to the collective, but not to just say, oh, I'm going to assume all of this as my responsibility, and now I have to go and read whatever, and then understand, oh, this is me, you know. Jung writes, everything that irritates us about others can lead to an understanding about ourselves. And I think that's very important, you know. Go through the world with open eyes, in a way. I think that's the call that Jung makes. Watch the waves, the resonances, whatever you want to call it. See how you react to certain things. See how others react to you. And think about what that means for you. You know, what does that mean for the structure, for the complexes within your unconscious? And what does it mean for the bigger picture? But then, don't identify with it necessarily, because identification is, of course, a mechanism of the ego, right? If you then say, oh, I'm now gonna really be, you know, understanding my evil side, then that's gonna become an aspect of your ego in that very instant. And that means it's not going to be part of your shadow anymore. But, and this is very important, as Jung says, light requires darkness, and darkness requires light, but light requires darkness, so there's going to be another aspect in the shadow. So it's a never-ending story. You're trying to find a balance here. Light can't be tyrannical, just as darkness can be tyrannical. But we have to learn to see it and recognize it. And this brings me to and this is the final closing remark, to this. I said this once about karma, that essentially karma is simply this idea that, at least I think from a Jungian standpoint, we can interpret it as that you can turn left today. You're on a crossroad, you can turn left today, but you're going to have to turn right at some point. You know, that possibility, that option, that choice, that other choice is going to confront you again. And I think that's crucial to understand, because you can integrate your shadow, you can integrate this and that function, but something will replace it. And you have to be aware that it's a lifelong path, this whole work. You know, some people think, oh, I'm going to integrate everything in my shadow and then I'll be enlightened. It's like, no, I don't think so. But anyways, thanks for tuning in. See you next time. And again, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate a comment, what you want to see in other videos, or what you liked about this video particularly, or what you didn't like. And please subscribe to stay in touch.